In the mid-1970s, American variety television was already on shaky ground. The big network song and dance hours that had carried the format for 2 decades were running out of audience, and prime time was tilting toward edgier sitcoms and police dramas. Into that uncertain landscape walked a show built around frogs, pigs, and a cantankerous chef who could not be understood. American networks did not want it. It ended up being shot in England, and it quietly became one of the most internationally watched programs of its era. Behind the felt and the fur, The Muppet Show hid a production story far stranger than its on-screen chaos. Here are 23 secrets from the years it ran. Number 1. The 1969 pitch that started it. Years before the series finally went into production, Jim Henson was already pitching a variety show built around what he called dogs, frogs, and monsters. The phrase comes from materials he was circulating to networks at the end of the 1960s when the Muppets were still mostly known from commercials and brief television spots. Nobody bought it. The pitch wandered through executive offices for the better part of 7 years before anyone agreed to put real money behind a weekly version of the idea. In retrospect, the original concept survived intact across all those rejections. The strange tonal mix that defined the eventual series, with children's show charm wrapped around adult comedy timing, monsters used for warmth rather than fright, and a host figure who was constantly losing control of his own program, was already there in the late 60s pitch documents. Henson did not stumble into the formula late. He had been carrying it around for most of a decade, looking for somebody who would let him build it. The eventual deal came not from American television, but from across the Atlantic, where a producer named Lou Grade decided the idea was worth a season. The version that finally premiered in 1976 was not the result of a sudden creative breakthrough, but the result of 7 years of patient, slightly bewildered insistence that this particular strange thing would work if the right person took the chance. Number 2. 2 pilots tested the madness. On paper, Henson had 2 test runs to figure out what the new variety show should be. In practice, the 2 pilots pulled in opposite directions, and the final series was built out of the gap between them. The first attempt aired in 1974 as a Valentine's Day special, with Mia Farrow as the celebrity guest. That format leaned warm and conventional, a gentle showcase that proved the Muppets could carry a half hour with a real-world star and not collapse into chaos. The second pilot, made the following year under a deliberately provocative working title, dropped the celebrity guest entirely and pushed the comedy harder, sharper, and more adult than anything Henson had aired before. Sketches ran longer, the jokes had teeth, the puppet ensemble was given room to be strange. Neither pilot is what the eventual series became. The Valentine special was too soft, the 1975 pilot was too cynical, and the version that premiered in 1976 sat between them. From the first attempt, Henson kept the celebrity guest spine. From the second, he kept the willingness to let the puppet world be weirder than children's television usually allowed. What looked like 2 false starts was really a deliberate triangulation, and the show found its footing because both pilots were allowed to fail in different directions before the right balance got drawn out of them. Number 3. America nearly rejected the magic. For most of the early 70s, no major American network would commit to a weekly Muppet Show. The reason was not creative doubt about Henson, since by then he had Sesame Street, several specials, and a recognizable brand. The reason was that the executives could not figure out what audience the program was for. Henson's Sesame Street work had locked the Muppets, in network minds, into the children's category. A primetime variety hour with the same performers behind the same kind of puppets struck programmers as a contradiction the audience would refuse to accept. CBS, NBC, and ABC all looked at it. All 3 concluded that adults would refuse to watch a puppet show and children would be confused by adult-pitched comedy. The verdict was effectively unanimous, and after years of meetings, the project had nowhere left to go inside the United States. The rescue came from the British impresario Lou Grade, whose ATV company was already buying American-style entertainment for international syndication. Grade saw the same pitch the American networks had rejected and read it the opposite way. To him, an audience comfortable with both the strange and the sincere was not a problem, but the entire premise. The series that would eventually win Emmys and Peabodys nearly never reached production at all, and the only reason it did was that one British executive trusted the instinct 3 American networks had talked themselves out of. Number 4. Chaos became the real format. On most variety programs of the era, the chaos was hidden. Cameras stayed off the missed cues, the broken props, the tantrums in the wings. This show did the opposite. It pulled the curtain back on an imaginary backstage and made the disasters part of the act. The structure was simple, but unusual for its time. Each episode was framed as a single, struggling theatrical performance, with Kermit running between dressing rooms and trying to coax the next number onto the stage while sketches collapsed. Fights broke out and acts went missing. The audience saw the polished number, then the chaos that produced it, then the polished number again. The two registers fed each other, and the running gags about explosions, hecklers, and unreliable performers became the connective tissue between the songs and sketches. What made this work as a format rather than a gimmick was that the writers committed to it completely. The backstage world had its own continuity, its own minor characters, its own grudges. The sketches stopped being interrupted by the chaos and started being motivated by it. By the second season, the chaos was not the wrapper around the show, but the show itself, and the polished numbers were what the chaos kept failing to produce. That structural inversion is rare in variety television, and it is what gave the series a narrative engine the song and dance hours of the era did not have. Number 5. Kermit was Henson in disguise. Jim and Kermit were the same person. That was Frank Oz, looking back, summing up almost 2 decades of working alongside Henson at the show that made both of them famous. Henson did not write Kermit as a literal stand-in for himself, but the parallels accumulated until the character read as autobiographical. Kermit's role inside the fictional theater was to manage extreme personalities, smooth over disasters, and keep an ambitious creative venture from flying apart while never raising his voice. That was almost line for line what Henson was doing each week with a cast of puppeteers, writers, guest stars, and a network across the ocean. The character became the most accurate document of the producer that anyone close to the program ever produced. He voiced Kermit quietly, played him as patient rather than long-suffering, and let the comic frustration come from the world around him rather than from anything Kermit himself did. The choices were unfussy enough to read as character. Over time, they revealed themselves as something more personal, and the people closest to the production were the first to stop pretending the connection was accidental. By the time Oz delivered his line, it was confirmation, not revelation. Number 6. Britain secretly shaped the show. Elstree Studios in early 1976 looked nothing like the New York television environment Jim Henson had grown up in. The complex sat on the edge of London, surrounded by fields and low industrial buildings, and the soundstage assigned to the new puppet variety series had been fitted with British technical crews, British camera operators, and a working day shaped by British union rules. The puppets and a small corps of American puppeteers had crossed the Atlantic to use it. The relocation was driven by Lou Grade's deal, but its consequences went far beyond the financing. Elstree had a tradition of theatrical and film production stretching back decades, and the technicians assigned to the series were used to shooting scripted comedy at a high level of polish. The lighting they brought, the practical effects discipline they enforced, and the routine availability of orchestral musicians gave the show a baseline of craft American syndication budgets would not have supported. Henson's team adapted fast. The puppeteers found that working under cameras operated by people trained on British sketch comedy let them push performances harder, because the camera operators were already comfortable with the rhythms of a moving sight gag. The personality of the program shifted in the first season as a result. The humor took on a faintly theatrical, almost music hall quality the original American pilots had not had. The pacing was slower in places but warmer, and the running jokes acquired the slightly absent-minded quality of British variety television in its prime. Visiting American guests were the ones who had to adjust, not the home crew. By the end of the first run, the production had stopped feeling like an American show shot in England. It was something newer, and the British shaping of its tone was permanent. The Muppet Show would never be made anywhere else, and the studio environment that absorbed it in 1976 left its fingerprints on every season that followed. Number 7. The opening sold the madness. The title sequence opened on a packed theater stage, monsters crammed into proscenium arches, brass instruments blaring from a band pit, and a chorus of mismatched puppets declaring that the show was about to start. The whole thing ran under a minute and asked the audience to absorb roughly 24 characters, an orchestra, a heckler balcony, a host frog, and a torrent of small visual gags that did not stop moving. None of it was explained. The opening simply demanded that viewers accept the rhythm and keep up. That was the point. The sequence was engineered to do the teaching in advance. By the time the first sketch began, the audience had already learned that this was a program where the chaos was deliberate, the cast was enormous, and nobody on screen took the staging too seriously. Sketches that would have needed 30 seconds of setup in any other variety hour got their setup for free because the title sequence had preloaded the world. It is the opening sequence, more than any single sketch, that television historians point to as the moment the format announced itself. The audience had been trained before the first joke landed. Number 8. Miss Piggy was almost different. Early designs for Miss Piggy did not promise a star. The character existed in earlier Muppet appearances as a generic chorus pig, one of several similar puppets used for crowd scenes, and her early drafts on the new variety series were no more distinct than that. Within a season, she had become the most magnetic figure on the show. The transformation came from 2 specific people pulling in the same direction. The first was Bonnie Erickson, the Muppet Workshop designer who reworked Piggy's look. She enlarged the eyes, gave her a styled blonde wig, and dressed her in the kind of glamour lapelled outfits that telegraphed self-conscious vanity rather than bashful charm. The pearls, the gloves, the dramatic eyelashes pulled the character out of background ensemble territory and gave her the visual presence of a leading lady. The redesign worked as character description before any dialogue had been written. The second was Frank Oz. He had already been performing the puppet, but once Erickson's redesign locked in, his choices sharpened around it. He gave her temper, romantic delusions about Kermit, a streak of sudden physical aggression, and the comic timing of an actress who refused to share a scene. By the third season, she was carrying her own sketches, getting the biggest laughs of the episode, and pulling magazine covers no other character on the show had been offered. She had stopped being one of the cast and become the brand. Number 9. Gonzo needed an upgrade. Through the first season, Gonzo was the weakest of the major recurring characters. The puppet had been carried over from earlier Henson productions with minor changes, and his small fixed eyes gave him almost no facial range. Performers called the result flat. Audience reaction was lukewarm. He was at risk of being phased out. The fix came from Dave Goelz, who performed the character and also worked in the Muppet Workshop as a builder. He redesigned the head with new eyelids that could droop, blink at different speeds, and hold the kind of half-melancholy expressions the original could not produce. The technical change was small, and the character change was enormous. Goelz had given himself a face he could actually act through, and Gonzo became almost overnight the show's most expressive secondary lead. By the third season, he was carrying sketches the writers would not have given the original puppet. The whole pivot turned on the eyelids. Number 10. The chef needed 4 hands. The Swedish Chef did things on screen that should not have been possible for a single puppeteer to do at once. He chopped, threw, juggled vegetables, and reached into the back of his counter for objects with both hands at once, all while his face remained animated and his mouth ran a continuous stream of nonsense. No glove-style Muppet works that way. The performer's one hand controls the head and mouth. The second hand can manage one puppet hand at a time, not 2. The chef did not work that way. He had 2 performers. Jim Henson handled the head, the mouth, and the voice from inside the puppet, while a second performer, most often Frank Oz in the early seasons, knelt below and to the side, with both arms extended into the chef's actual sleeves to operate the live human hands the character required. From the audience's angle, the seam was invisible. From a few feet away, the setup was a controlled tangle of 2 grown men pressed against each other under a counter, syncing every chop and grab in real time, so the chef looked like a single chaotic person rather than 2 crouching ones. It is the only major character on the show built that way. Every other Muppet was a one puppeteer performance. The chef was the exception, and the exception is what made him feel alive. Number 11. Guests had to give up control. The unspoken contract for celebrity guests was simpler and more humbling than most variety bookings of the era required. The show would build the episode around them, but it would not let them be the funniest thing in it. The puppet cast would get the biggest laughs, the visual gags would belong to the workshop, and any guest who tried to dominate the proceedings the way they would on a network talk show would find themselves stranded. Most guests adapted within their first day. The smarter ones came in already understanding the dynamic. Steve Martin played the experience as performance art. Liberace dressed for the puppets rather than the audience, and Vincent Price delivered his episode at the same theatrical pitch the cast was working at. The ones who struggled were guests used to controlling the room. They had to learn to share the frame, to set up the puppets rather than work against them, and to tolerate being upstaged by performers they could not see. Most adjusted by the end of the first taping day. A few never fully did, and the difference is visible in the episodes. Across the run, the dynamic became part of the show's reputation. By the later seasons, accepting a booking was widely understood as agreeing to be the supporting act in the cast's room. The guests who showed up under that understanding had the best episodes. The guests who showed up still expecting to be the headliner had the more uneven ones, and the audience could always tell the difference. Number 12. The writers found their voices. In the spring of 1976, when the production was assembling its first writing room at Elstree, the head writer was Jack Burns. Burns had a sketch comedy background, an instinct for fast structure, and a clear sense of what variety television in the post-Laugh-In era was supposed to look like. His season 1 scripts gave the show its sketch architecture and its hosting rhythms, and the early character voices were largely his. Burns left after the first season. The writer who replaced him as the show's central voice was Jerry Juhl, and the change is the reason the characters sound the way audiences remember them. Juhl had been with Henson since the early 1960s. He had written for Sam and Friends the early commercials, the network specials, the variety pilots, and the children's projects. He understood the puppets the way the performers did, in the sense that he had been around them while they were being figured out, and the voices he gave them had the unhurried, character-first quality the first season's faster sketch writing did not. The shift was structural as much as it was tonal. Under Burns, sketches drove characters. Under Juhl, characters drove sketches, and the writing room reorganized around the principle that any joke had to make sense for the specific puppet delivering it. Kermit's patience, Piggy's vanity, Fozzie's neediness, Gonzo's cheerful incomprehensibility, and Scooter's anxious helpfulness all sharpened across seasons 2 and 3 because the writers had stopped reaching for generic variety show rhythms and started writing for specific personalities. The ensemble feeling, the sense that the audience was visiting a real workplace populated by real coworkers, came directly from this shift. The lasting effect was that the writing built the world the performers could then inhabit, rather than the other way around. By season 3, the characters were stable enough that new writers joining the room had to learn the voices rather than invent them. That stability is what allowed the cast to evolve across the run without the program losing its coherence, and it is the reason audiences who came in late never felt they had walked into a different show. The character voices built in those early seasons would still be intact 30 years later. Number 13. SNL taught Henson what failed. For the first season of Saturday Night Live in 1975 and 1976, Henson produced a recurring segment for the program titled The Land of Gorch. The puppets were not the familiar Muppets. They were a separate set of new characters, designed for a primetime adult audience and written with the deliberately rough, cynical edge the early SNL writers' room considered the signature of the program. The segments did not connect with audiences. Within a season, they were quietly retired. What troubled Henson was not the cancellation. It was the diagnosis. The Gorch material had everything the segment was theoretically supposed to want, including genuine adult comedy, satirical edge, and characters built for late-night sensibilities, and audiences still drifted away from it. The writers around him at SNL, including Michael O'Donoghue, were uninterested in the warmth Henson treated as load-bearing, and the puppets were left without the quality that, in retrospect, every successful Muppet performance had been built on. The lesson took. By the time the variety show went into production at Elstree the following year, Henson had recommitted to the principle that the Muppets worked when the audience felt real affection between the characters and from the production toward its audience. The harder, drier register that had appeared in the 1975 pilot was softened. Guest chemistry was prioritized. The Gorch experience had effectively ruled a path out, and the version of the Muppet Show that premiered 6 months later was sharper for knowing what it was not. Number 14. Hidden hands made it real. A few feet beneath the polished Muppet stage, the working environment was much less glamorous. Performers crouched, knelt, or lay flat on their backs underneath raised platforms, holding puppets above their heads for hours at a time, with their faces tilted up towards small monitors that showed them what the camera was seeing. They could not look at the puppet they were performing. They could only look at the screen. The physical setup was a constant strain. Holding a Muppet at the correct angle requires the performer's arm to be extended fully overhead and then to stay there through takes, retakes, blocking adjustments, and lighting holds. A typical session ran for hours. Long-form scenes meant hidden arm extenders, awkward bracing against the underside of the platform, and the kind of slow-developing back and shoulder problems that accumulate across a season. Some scenes required two performers crammed together in spaces narrower than a closet, syncing puppet movements at performance speed while trying not to bump each other. The camera monitor setup added a second layer of difficulty. Performers had to learn to act through a screen, judging the puppet's expressions, eye lines, and physical comedy from a small black and white image rather than from direct sightline. New performers found the inversion disorienting. Veterans learned to think backwards in real time, mapping their hand movements through the puppet, through the camera angle, through the monitor, and back to their own intentions, all while delivering dialogue and character. Early Muppet performers from the Sam and Friends era had pioneered the technique on local television. By the time the variety series was running, the craft had been refined for over 15 years, but the discomfort had not. The reason the work shows up nowhere on screen is that it was specifically designed to disappear. None of the magic in any episode is possible without the labor underneath it, and almost none of that labor was ever filmed for behind-the-scenes use. How much of what audiences experienced as effortless charm was, in fact, the product of physical work nobody outside the production ever saw? The honest answer is most of it. Number 15. Friends opened the first doors. For most of the first season, the way Henson got famous people onto a show that had not yet aired looked less like a booking process than a series of personal phone calls. The series had no audience track record at the start. American networks had passed on it. The pilot tapes were strange enough that selling them cold to a major star's representatives was not a reliable strategy, and the production had no budget to compete with the variety hours already running on American television. What it had instead was Henson's reputation across the entertainment industry as someone trustworthy, generous, and unusually pleasant to work with. The earliest guests came almost entirely through that network. Some were friends from the New York comedy scene. Some had worked with Henson on previous specials. Some came through as manager Bernie Brillstein's other clients. A few had children who watched Sesame Street and were curious enough to take the call. By the end of season 1, the bookings stopped being acts of personal trust and started being competitive applications. Word had traveled fast, and once the show was understood inside the industry as an unusually fun thing to do, agents began pushing their clients toward it. Season 2's guest list was no longer a tour through Henson's address book. It was a tour through whoever was suddenly insisting they wanted in. Number 16. The songs were never filler. In the orchestra pit just below the front of the Muppet Theater set, a real ensemble of session musicians sat for hours every taping day, playing live arrangements written for that week's episode. The pit was not for show. It was the working musical engine of the program, and the program would not have functioned without it. Variety television in the late 1970s often treated musical numbers as breathing room between sketches, moments for the audience to settle while the next comic setup got built. This show treated the music exactly the opposite way. Its musical director, Larry Grossman, and the writers and arrangers who worked alongside him approached the songs as the centerpieces around which the comedy was structured. Guest singers were not booked because they happened to be famous. They were booked because the production wanted to stage their songs at a level the variety competition was no longer reaching for. Linda Ronstadt, Rita Moreno, Loretta Lynn, Andy Williams, Liberace, and the long list of others who passed through were given full production numbers, complete with choreography, set pieces, costuming, and character interaction that the rest of variety television was abandoning as too expensive to mount weekly. The show also built an in-house band. Dr. Teeth and the Electric Mayhem were not just visual gags. They were the musical identity of the program, voiced and performed by the same puppeteers who handled the rest of the cast, with arrangements written specifically for them by the music staff. Their numbers ran across multiple registers, including rock, R&B, country, and parody. And Janice's vocal lines, Floyd's bass, Animal's drum performances, and Zoot's saxophone interludes were treated with the kind of attention real working bands received from real working music programs of the era. The Electric Mayhem were not parodies of musicians. They were musicians played as characters. By the end of the run, the show's contribution to musical television was substantial enough that historians of the form treat it as a peer of dedicated music shows of the period rather than as a comedy program with songs attached. Cast albums sold. Cover versions of original songs entered the standards repertoire. Songwriters cited the program as the place that had taught them what variety music could still look like at full ambition. The series had refused to treat its musical hours as filler, and the legacy followed. Number 17. Stars got the London treatment. A typical first-day welcome packet on the show waiting for an arriving guest at their hotel included a brief production schedule, a cast guide showing which puppets would appear in their episode, and a small London tourist booklet with restaurants worth trying, sites walking distance from Elstree, and advice on getting around the city by black cab. The packets were assembled by the production office, not the network, and the level of care was not standard for a syndicated program of the era. The trouble Henson's team took on the off-camera side was deliberate. A guest who had never worked with puppets would arrive nervous, sometimes visibly so. The packets, the dinners with the writers, the patient walkthroughs of how the puppeteers would be positioned during their scenes, and the small courtesies extended to families who had come along were all designed to make the working day feel like a gift rather than a job. Once the British setting was understood as the production's home rather than its inconvenience, the welcome was structured to introduce visitors to it kindly. The result was that guests who had agreed to appear out of curiosity left as enthusiastic recommenders, and the next round of bookings became easier than the last. Number 18. Syndication changed everything. The show was sold through first-run syndication and international distribution rather than as the property of a single American network. That distribution model was unusual for a high-budget variety program in the late 1970s, and it shaped almost every creative decision the production was free to make. A network-owned series faced standards departments, time slot priorities, and adjustment notes from executives who needed the program to fit alongside the rest of the primetime schedule. A syndicated series sold market by market did not. The show could be edgier or warmer depending on the week, could feature guests American networks would not have prioritized, and could trust that international audiences would arrive without the same baseline expectations a domestic audience brought. Lou Grade's ATV operation, which produced the program for global sale, had been built around exactly this kind of distribution and was comfortable, letting the creative decisions rest with Henson and his writers. The financial structure mattered as much as the editorial freedom. Because the show was selling into more than 100 international territories at once, the per-territory revenue did not need to be enormous to make the production profitable. That math freed the writers from chasing American ratings as the only success metric and gave the program creative latitude that was not available to most of its time slot competitors. By the end of the run, audiences in Britain, Canada, Australia, Germany, France, Japan, and a long list of other markets were watching the program weekly. Without first-run syndication, none of that would have been organizationally possible. Number 19. The real cast was bigger. Public attention through the run focused on Jim Henson and Frank Oz. The bench behind them was deeper than that focus suggested, and most of the performers who built the secondary characters into recurring fixtures never received the public recognition the lead puppeteers did. Richard Hunt voiced Statler, Scooter, Beaker, and Janice, often in the same episode, switching characters within a sketch the way a stage actor switches scenes. Jerry Nelson handled Floyd Pepper, Robin, Lou Zealand, Crazy Harry, and the announcer, carrying both the bandleader's casual cool and the small frog's unguarded warmth in the same recording day. Dave Goelz had Gonzo, Bunsen Honeydew, Beauregard, and Zoot. Aaron Oscar performed early in the run before stepping back, and Louise Gold joined later, bringing the lone female puppeteer presence the production had otherwise been missing. Each of them was carrying multiple characters at performance level for full taping days, with the kind of vocal and physical range scripted comedy normally requires entire ensembles of actors to cover. The depth of the bench is the reason any given episode could field as many distinct character voices as it did without sounding like the same 5 people doing accents. It is also the reason the program kept finding new corners to develop. How many of the recurring characters audiences remember today were carried by performers whose names they never learned? The honest answer covers most of the show's secondary cast, and that answer is one of the quiet costs of working inside a brand whose face was, by design, mostly somebody else's. Number 20. Awards proved it was serious. 3 Emmys, a Peabody, and a BAFTA. The show's awards resume over its 5-season run was disproportionate to the perception of variety television in the late 1970s, and unprecedented for a syndicated puppet program. The Emmys came in 1978, 1979, and 1981, including Outstanding Comedy Variety Series and writing wins for The Show's Room. The Peabody, awarded in 1978, recognized broadcasting that served the public good. The BAFTA, awarded across the British production years, treated the program as the equal of any primetime British comedy. The point of cataloging the trophies is not the trophies themselves, but what they corrected. Inside the entertainment industry of the era, anything involving puppets was assumed to be lightweight, or for children only. The major awards bodies broke from that assumption one organization at a time, and each prize made it harder for the industry to continue treating the program as a curiosity. By the show's final season, the question of whether The Muppet Show was a serious piece of television had stopped being asked. The trophies on the office shelves had answered it for everyone. Number 21. The lineup kept changing. The series looked from outside like a stable ensemble. The same theater, the same backstage, the same regular characters running the same recurring bits across 5 seasons. The truth was almost the opposite. The cast at the end of the run was substantially different from the cast at the start, and the show's quiet ability to reinvent itself is one of the reasons the format never went stale. Some early characters faded out as the writers found audiences responded more strongly to others. Hilda the Wardrobe Lady, prominent in season 1, gradually disappeared. Wayne and Wanda, the doomed singing duo, were quietly retired after their gimmick exhausted itself. The original Muppet News segment evolved as the writers found new comic shapes for it. Meanwhile, characters who had been minor early in the run grew as their performers leaned into them. Beaker barely existed before season 2. Janice's voice and personality stabilized only later. Lou Zealand was a season 4 addition. The Swedish Chef started small and accumulated screen time as the audience response built. The writing room, the same room whose shift from Burns to Juhl had stabilized the core voices, was constantly making small bets on which of the secondary characters could carry more weight, and most of those bets paid off. The result was a show that felt the same week to week, and yet was not the same. Audiences who came in early and stayed through the run watched a quiet replacement happen in slow motion, and most of them never noticed it was happening. How many other long-running variety programs of the era could say the same? Number 22. Museums turned it into history. Inside the National Museum of American History in Washington, in a glass case maintained at carefully controlled humidity, sits a green felt frog with ping-pong ball eyes and a hand-stitched mouth. The original Kermit, donated by the Henson family, is one of more than a dozen Muppet artifacts the Smithsonian preserves as part of its entertainment collection. They are not displayed as toys. Across the United States and the United Kingdom, similar institutional acquisitions have followed. Original puppets, set pieces, and production materials from the show have entered serious museum collections at the Center for Puppetry Arts in Atlanta, the Museum of the Moving Image in New York, and other institutions whose curatorial criteria require something more than nostalgia. Miss Piggy, Kermit, Fozzie, Gonzo, and the rest are now historical objects in the same way early sound recordings or pioneering film cameras are historical objects. The acquisitions arrived in waves over decades, but the cumulative effect is unmissable. The show's characters have outlived its broadcast life by more than 40 years, and the climate-controlled cases now holding them are the official confirmation that the audience consensus and the institutional consensus have finally arrived in the same place. Number 23. The show launched an empire. The series went off the air in 1981 because Henson chose to end it, not because anyone had run out of audience for it. The reason he chose to end it is the answer to almost everything that came afterward in the Henson catalog. By the final season, the production had outgrown its variety show frame. The team had developed the technical capacity, the writing depth, and the international audience reach that would make the leap to feature film realistic, and the Muppet movie, released in 1979 while the series was still running, had already proved the brand would carry into theaters. Henson's instinct, which had been right about almost every previous transition, was that the next phase belonged on bigger formats with bigger ambitions. Within a few years of the show's end, his team was producing The Dark Crystal, Fraggle Rock, Labyrinth, and a feature program of Muppet films that would continue rolling out for decades. The technical innovations the show had quietly funded, including the underwater puppetry rigs, the radio-controlled facial mechanisms, and the increasingly sophisticated walking shots, became the foundation of the more ambitious creature work that defined the Henson Company's 1980s output. None of those projects would have been institutionally possible without the show. The series gave Henson the international audience, the financial track record, the trained ensemble of performers, the writing talent, the technical workshop, and the sustained working relationships with British production infrastructure the rest of the empire was built on. It also gave him the credibility, after the Emmys and the Peabody and the BAFTA, to walk into any meeting in Hollywood or London and have his next idea taken seriously on the strength of his name alone. The leap from variety television to feature filmmaking and prestige television, which had defeated many of his contemporaries, took him no time at all because the show had already done the structural work. When viewers today recognize a Henson-style production at a glance, with its warmth, its technical ambition, and its willingness to commit to a fictional world completely, they are recognizing a sensibility forged across 5 seasons of weekly variety television in a British studio. Without those years, none of what followed would have looked the way it does. The Muppet Show did not just succeed, it made everything that came after it possible. Most of the Muppet Show's charm was the product of unglamorous discipline. Networks turned the show down, production relocated across an ocean, performers crouched in cramped spaces under stages while audiences saw something effortless. The writing room, the orchestra pit, the workshop, the slow redesigns of secondary characters, all of it converged into a program that looked from outside like it had been born that way. The image at the heart of it stays the same: Kermit trying to manage chaos he cannot actually contain. That image is also a portrait of Henson and his team running an experiment they barely held together for 5 years before walking away from it by choice. None of the empire that followed is accidental, and if this look behind the curtain meant something to you, hitting like and subscribing genuinely helps the channel keep doing deep dives like this one. If a particular character or moment from the show stuck with you, the comment section is open below.